All right. We have Ben Ashworth here. Sam's here as well. Ben, thanks for coming on, man.
Absolute pleasure. Really glad to be invited to come on the show.
Yeah. Could you give a little background on yourself and all of the current roles and things you're running with right now?
Yeah, sure. So background is physiotherapist by trade. So 20 years, basically a couple of decades in the industry now in sport, working with different teams, from rugby to Olympic sports to Premier League football. Um, and then spent the last 10 years in football, but have been developing a lot of conversations around athletic shoulders with different teams and individuals. And now I'm exclusively working. I set up my own company. I'm exclusively working with athletic shoulders with clients and individuals in the UK and also with teams abroad. Um, and so that's probably a good quick summary of where I'm at. I'm a physio who's got a big interest in monitoring, testing, and also loading and rehabilitation. So, kind of strength and conditioning and how that might fit in as well as part of what I can offer.
Why shoulders out of all joints and regions of the body?
Well, as you know, all the other parts of the body are easy, and so I wanted to challenge myself. And I say that very tongue in cheek. I probably found myself in a position where I was dealing with a lot of shoulders with one of my roles, where I was in charge of the British judo team, and I mean physio in charge of providing support to athletes. And we had a high proportion of shoulder injuries, and so you had to get pretty good at them because you're dealing with maybe five slap rehabs at a time, or different ongoing daily acute injuries. And that interest just grew. And then I read more and I learned more and I worked with some good people. And then I started to be asked about shoulders, and that grew and that developed. And then, yeah, that's how it ended up just growing out of nothing, really. But I think it was a definite target of mine to try and find a specialism, to try and develop a specialism which would differentiate me from other physios in the industry. And it turns out it was probably a pretty good decision.
I was listening, you were on Inform Performance, I think in 22. I was listening this morning. Are you still working on your PhD? You had said in the podcast the goal was 2023.
Wow, that was an ambitious goal. I think with COVID and with everything that happened since, plus being a director of performance in European football, the PhD suffered. And I've taken it back up now. So the aim is, and the extension on it is till January 2025. But I've done all my data collection. I just need to get the stats done and then write it up. And I think I'll probably finish by early next year.
And what exactly are you looking at for that specific research? If you
Yeah.
could talk
So
about it.
it's morphed into um, essentially looking at the key determinants of throwing performance, and that has been uh, influenced heavily by some of the work I've been doing over the last few years with baseball teams, and also how my research is aligned with the work I've been doing with those teams. So we look at the forces that people are producing and the kinetics and how we test them, and then also how that relates to certain variables around the kinematics and how we move. And so I did part of the study in Nebraska at the Performance Lab with a really good team there and some pretty good NCAA pitchers. And then I've also had access when I was in Prague to the lab there. So we did some stuff with Czech baseball, Czech elite volleyball players. So essentially, it's going to be key determinants of overhead athletes in terms of health and performance. And that's around force testing and then also looking at kinematics.
Well, congrats on being close to the end. somewhat.
Some would argue I'm still 100 steps away from finishing it, and it feels like I need to just get stuck into it for a block of time, and I think it won't take me too long to get it finished.
Awesome. Well, the primary discussion point for today is going to be on shoulder testing, more specifically the ASH test, which you created. Let's create just initial background on how you came up with the ASH test itself, and then the population you initially utilized it or started testing, and then we can go into more specifics of the setup and differentiated it to other shoulder tests.
Yeah, it's basically the stars aligned, and I was working with Arsenal Football Club, and we were looking at a lot of lower body injuries. We were doing a lot of force platform testing alongside profiling and monitoring to look at lower limb based injuries. And I think it's the same with most things around shoulders. Is the lower limb is way ahead of the upper limb in terms of research, understanding, development, progress. So I was working with a guy, Daniel Cohen, Dr. Daniel Cohen, who's a force plate expert, and he and I knew the team, one of the rugby teams in the UK, Saracens, who've won European championships, and they're one of the top teams in Europe. And so their physio and their strength coach, Daniel Cohen and myself, got our heads together, and they were trying to solve the problem of why collision athletes were breaking down when they went into sort of tackle positions and long lever tackle positions. So because of my sort of field-based mindset and trying to do stuff that gave you information back quickly so you could make decisions, we wanted to take the lower limb testing we were doing with the hamstrings on force platforms and then apply that to try and solve this long lever force production problem. And I ended up going in early in the morning to Arsenal and playing with the force plates, and came up with the ASH test, which is a face down, prone lying, isometric maximal test in a T, a Y, and an I position. And so that's how it evolved. And then we did some pilot work, and the early stages were quite exciting in that it was picking up people who'd had historical shoulder problems. It was also picking up people who'd had neck injuries like burners and stingers more short term. And so there was a definite benefit from an injury profile, and it was able to identify and was sensitive to deficits. But as we'll go into, there were some other interesting findings around it, including rate of force development as well as just peak force production in the test.
And comparing that to more of the shorter lever positions in primarily utilizing handheld dynamometry, what you mentioned it a little bit, but what are uh, the testing positions for people maybe who don't even utilize that? Let's say you're trying to test internal, external, uh, flexion, abduction based positions. How would you do that for utilizing a dynamometer? And then we can kind of have a bigger picture of how these are utilized in
Yeah, I
combination.
think your question's a good one. It leads on a little bit from something I missed out there, and the fact was that the Saracens team were already testing using dynamometry with shorter lever positions, and they were finding that people were passing those tests and then going out and breaking down when they returned to contact. So this was the gap, the knowledge space that we needed to fill. So going back to the dynamometer, historically, people have tested in um, neutral levels of shoulder abduction with the arm by the side, and they've looked at external versus internal rotation, which is a useful measure, and it can be good to isolate the posterior shoulder as an example when the arm's by the side. But most of injuries and most performance happens with the arm up in more abducted shoulder positions. So I think with the dynamometer, um, historically it has been used to look at scapular plane abduction, so the full can. it's been used to look at external and internal rotation with the arm by the side. And it's also been utilized to look at external rotation and internal rotation in 90 degrees of abduction. And so I think, as we'll go into, I'm sure in a minute, that there are some differences between what you get out of those short lever testing positions and the higher torques that you have to withstand or cope with, or higher torques that you're having to produce when you add in that long lever, which creates this higher challenge to instability.
So when you say short lever versus long lever, maybe we should clarify that quickly.
Yeah. So just with a short lever, we're talking about bent elbow. So the elbow at 90 degrees. And in terms, therefore, of the distance that the force is being applied from the shoulder, it's often like closer to the axis of rotation, and therefore, whatever force you apply, the lever isn't long, so therefore, it's not creating as high a torque. When you start to go out into long lever positions with the arm straight, the distance is further from the force application to the shoulder itself, so we're getting higher. If you're a physicist, you might argue it's not torque, but definitely higher forces across the shoulder joint.
And it's not this is going to replace these shorter lever positions. It's just complementing them and then exposing potentially end stage weaknesses or positions that are inherently more vulnerable for these athletes and positions that will need to get into those positions repeatedly.
Yeah, exactly that. We didn't know at the start whether or not this was going to add any value at all, right? So we thought hypothetically it'd be a good thing to do. And what we found and other groups have found since is that actually the ASH test doesn't correspond or correlate to short lever testing. They tell you something different. So it is worthwhile doing both short lever testing and long lever testing, and that's something I do when I'm looking at athletes, either in rehabilitation or in profiling.
To that point, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, the shorter lever testing will probably be performed earlier on and will be a little bit more tolerable. There's not a strong carryover, or they're not completely, if someone's strong in this short lever position, we don't know if they're going to always be strong. Is it more likely that it's the opposite? If they have better results in the ASH test, longer lever position, is it a pretty strong chance that they'll be there in shorter lever?
Yeah, I do sort of see the ASH test as being an overall sort of tip of the pyramid test, which if you can pass it, you've probably got a pretty healthy, high performing shoulder. And if you can't perform well in that test, you come down to another level of interrogation where you go, well, let's have a look and see why. Is it because of almost the rotator cuff function, which is what we tend to think of when we're looking at these kind of short lever bent elbow tests in rotation? Is it a force deficit there, or is it maybe an imbalance when we look at direction specific testing, so external rotation or internal rotation? But there are various relationships and interactions that you might see that relate not just to the ability to produce force at the shoulder, but also how you transfer force across the shoulder girdle. So it's not as simple as if you pass the ASH test, you will be good at internal and external rotation. Just picking up another thing you said there, I think sort of the idea of testing earlier on, one of the reasons why I test with the elbow down by the side with dynamometry is because you can test that quite soon after an operation. So it's an early marker of strength recovery in athletes before they've got necessarily the range or the permission to go up and test in those higher degrees of abduction. So it can be quite a useful marker early on after surgery.
Yeah, I think I've heard you in other podcasts talk about some of these. I don't know if you mentioned specifically Bankart, but more tightening position procedures. You've mentioned 6 or 8 weeks, and that early, very early testing, what information is that? Well, you kind of alluded to it, what it's providing you, but we already going to assume it's probably pretty darn weak. So how are you using that early on as opposed to 12 or 16 week initial testing? Does that just feel too delayed?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're considering what's ideal, you take as long as you need. But we know in the under the demands of sport, and certainly with some of the teams I've worked with, with NFL players, where the demand is to get them back in 10 or 11 weeks after shoulder surgery. You can't really wait till week 6 to 8 to start to work out whether you can push them or hold them back. And so with the temptation to push and push and push consistently from the player and the management and everybody involved, we need some objective information to know whether we can push. And so the use of having those markers early on is exactly that. You can start to say, well, actually things are on track. We can go forward. We can not accelerate, but we can maintain a faster recovery because we've actually done probably enough work prior to that point to build to a certain level. And it's not just about holding them back. It's about, can we push them forward? And that's the question we're asking. But if they come back and their markers are really low for what we'd expect at week 6, then there's a lot more work to be done. And therefore, we're probably going to have to think about a 2-week block of strength before we can start to go into more integrated functional activity, or a change in their programming. So it's a useful thing to help to guide our decisions around where we choose to go with the next part of their program, the next phase.
I'm sure it's athlete and position and surgery dependent, but
Yeah.
if you're testing at the 6 or 8 week time point, what are some numbers or symmetry values that would allow you to say, all right, green light, let's keep rocking and rolling, or let's have that 2-week period or some more isolated strength activity before progressing?
I mean, yeah, it is, as you say, it is dependent, but I mean, I can only give you a couple of cases I can think of offhand where an athlete has got 96% of their strength back by week 6. So at that point, strength isn't the focus. And equally, if we say take dynamometry as a nice score. I used to use dynamometry way back in the day before I had access to force platforms or fixed dynamometers like the force frame. But we used to set some standards, and I'm quite happy to set some standards. So if you had an external rotation test with a short lever with a bent elbow, it's one for a visual maybe, but essentially you're looking at trying to be above 20% of body weight. So, if you're looking at a 100 kilogram athlete and they're not pushing 20 kilograms, that's a concern. So when you test them early on, if they're looking at around sort of 14 to 16% of body weight and their pre-injury scores are 25 to 30, you can also know how far off they are. Are they 50% of the way back towards their full strength? And that often sits also with the athlete's own reporting of how they feel, the confidence levels and their relative readiness. So if you ask them a question and you trust them, how are you? They'll probably say, I'm at 50% when their scores are at 50%. So it sort of validates their own perception of their recovery as well as giving you an objective score. And I think that's quite important, that it's not just objective testing without context.
Do you find that the subjective report from the athletes is typically pretty similar to the objective scores?
Yeah, I had some stuff. I used to track everything when I was sort of trying to learn about shoulders, and I tracked absolutely everything. And it was remarkable how close that athlete reported perception. with the judo players, we used to ask a fitness to fight score. And once you frame the question and say, look, yeah, 100% is you fighting in a competition at your best ever. Where are you today? And they get it, they'll say 50%, and you'll look at their strength scores, and that'll be at 52% of where they are. It's remarkable correlation in most athletes who are aware of themselves. There's obviously a few outliers who haven't got a clue where they're at, and so that's why the objective data provides some pretty important information.
Were you using the ASH test with the judo players, or were you using different ones? Because they have some obviously different shoulder demanding positions.
Yeah, I wish I'd come up with it back then. I'd have a huge amount of information. But no, and I think this is a sort of lesson, and we'll come on to this later on, is I just used a dynamometer. I had a Lafayette dynamometer at the time, and I took that around the world with me with the judo team. And I used that and a goniometer, and those were my two key decision-making tools, which is very simplistic, but actually, is mobility or force the problem? And so what do we need to work on today to help them to improve? And what's our focus going to be? So it actually made things a lot clearer. And I think I've probably become a little bit more complex, but I've tried to maintain that simplicity. So anything you use, can we put it into a bucket? But no, I didn't use it. But what I was going to say then was that I still rehab people in longer lever positions. Even though I didn't have an objective score, I would still challenge them in those positions. And I think even in the absence of testing, you've got good coaches and good physios who do good rehab and will naturally, as part of their program, progressively challenge someone from in close to wider positions where they're more vulnerable. And they're very successful without putting a number on it. The problem comes when, that's not working with a particular individual or, for whatever reason, and you don't see it, and you push them forward and you're sort of guessing a little bit. That's when objective testing adds value. And I think that's the beauty of having something that looks at how strong you are in close, but also how strong you are in those more vulnerable, wider positions, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think judo is an interesting one. So it's great that you brought it up. I'm experienced being a judoka myself, and in the sport, like it has a pretty contrasting demand because of the relatively short lever positions that a lot of times they're in fourth rows, resisting different sort of submission holds versus like the classic overhead athlete where it is a lot longer lever position. But the judokas then often experience like a higher or a slower rate with a higher, I guess, force because you're moving against someone else's body versus, for instance, throwing a ball. So just sort of a different demand.
Yes, it is. It's exactly as you described. Most of my original work was trying to look at the throwing shoulder because we were dealing with throwing shoulders in judo. It's just the projectile slightly different. It's probably a 120 kilogram Korean rather than a baseball. And they're desperately trying hard to go the other way as well. So it does add a bit of complexity to rehab. That maybe you don't see in throwing a fastball, but yeah.
The 20% of body weight for that short lever ER position, before we go into the specifics of the ASH test and then some metrics we're looking at there, is there any other key numbers or percentages you're looking at for IR or any of those other short lever positions?
Yeah. I mean, I try and sort of set some standards. So it's almost like poor is below 20%. In that test, poor is below 20%. Good, a pass is above 20%. Good is 25%, and excellent is 30%. And that started in 2009 in judo and still held true in Premier League football goalkeepers in 2016. And it became a really nice line in the sand, and it help me to guide whether someone's good or bad or ugly. So I think that's really useful. And then, and also that's the relative value you see, because the peak force values obviously are going to be important, but how you handle your mass but how you handle someone else's mass, that's when relative values become important. So I've set some standards actually, and I've released them on social media around force frame testing, which is a fixed dynamometer looking at internal and external rotation. We've got a bucket load of baseball data now on that to know that actually an average score for a major league player is 170 newtons in external rotation and 180 newtons in internal rotation. An average score. And there's not a lot published, of course, because of the sensitivity around sharing information. But those are some pretty good lines in the sand. Internal slightly higher than external when we're looking at testing internal versus external rotation in 90 degrees abduction. But it does vary by position. So arm by the side is different to arm in abduction. And even if you lie on your back versus lying on your front, there's a slight difference in the scores and the ratios that you expect.
So going into the specifics of setting up the ASH test and then what exactly we're looking for or at, because it's through these force platforms as opposed to a dynamometer. You already mentioned this prone position, and then you mentioned the IYT, but can you go into, okay, you're going to test someone on it. What exactly, how would you set it up? And then what are within all the data on that force platform, what are you sifting through and looking for?
Yeah, firstly, that's a really good question because the process is hugely important, and the consistency around all these tests is, if you want to trust the data and use it, you have to have a consistent setup in terms of that original data acquisition. So the setup for the ASH test, we try and standardize it as much as we can, the body position. So we have a block under the forehead to standardize neck position. We have the feet hip width apart with the toes on the ground, so in a kind of neutral ankle position rather than toes pointing down. And there's a little bit of a difference between the eye test position, which is the arm in 180 right overhead, straight overhead, where the opposite arm is lying next to the body. It's quite a stable position, almost like a swimmer's position. But what we found in early testing was when we went out to the Y position, sort of 135 abduction, and then the T position, is if we allowed that arm to be by the side, we'd use it to cheat and to fix. So the arm was put in the small of the back, so it's put behind the back. And then that meant that we were reliant on our trunk a little bit more for force transfer and stability. So the setup is you lie on the ground, you put people in those positions. If we're testing an eye, it's 180. The hand rests with the heel of the hand on the platform. The elbow is as straight as the person can have it. And that's it. And where they start, they should finish the test. If you see them cheat, deviate, there's probably 4 different compensations, different types of compensation. Then we would note that down rather than coach them to do the test first. We want to see how they perform the test. And then we might start to say, look, actually, you're kicking out too much through your leg, or you're rotating too much through your pelvis, or you're leading with the shoulder and throwing the shoulder into the test. And the last one is you're bending the elbow, so you're trying to reduce the lever arm. So those are the 4 sort of classic compensations that we see with people trying to perform as well as they can in the test. But the test itself is performed on the force platform. We count them in, we give them a chance, and then we ask them to push as fast and hard as they can. So we capture that, excuse me, we capture that rate of force development in the very early phases, but then we also want to see their peak force, which tends to come on in around 1, 2, or 3 seconds in a 3-second isometric test.
And are you starting the first one in the eye position? And then are you doing multiple rounds of push as hard and as fast as you can in I, then you reset, go to Y, and then to T? Or what specifically does that process look like?
Yeah, the original protocol was I, then Y, then T. And we'd do left arm, then right arm. It's easier to read across the force trace. Originally it was left, then right, left, then right, left, then right. And we would do 3 tests in one position with one arm. So left arm, test 1, 20 seconds rest, test 2, 20 seconds rest, test 3, and then do the same repeat on the right arm. And then we'd move to the Y, and then we'd move to the T. So the rest period is really important, but I think we'll leave that for the moment and come back to it maybe. The overall protocol takes about 6 minutes when you're slick to look at all of those arm positions, I, Ys, and Ts, both limbs. We're only really needing to do that at the start of a season to get a benchmark. And when you've got unilateral athletes or people who are going to have demands of just one arm, in season, you may not need to do the whole arm. You might do just one arm, the dominant arm only. And other people have just, for ease of time and efficiency, have just picked probably the most sensitive for them in their sport or with their individual. So they might say, right, we've got all the data in preseason, but we're going to just test the T position only, and we're going to do that once a week throughout a return to play. And that's going to be our key marker. And it saves time, it stops you over testing an athlete, and it probably keeps you on board with them with regard to their compliance with the testing process.
And let's say you're testing all 3. Is there anything you've collectively found that you want to look at as comparison of they should be at this percentage of Y versus I versus T?
Yeah, that's a question that's been asked a lot, and until the other day, I hadn't really sort of picked a figure out. I was a little bit reluctant to do it, but let's do it here for the first time. So if your I is 100%, your Y is 85%, and your T is 75%. So it's a 1 to 0.85 to 0.75, something like that. That's very. Let's put that line in the sand for people. But what that means is that there probably is a normal range around those ratios. And if you saw that there was a big drop off in a Y position, but they were able to produce force in an I and a T, you'd think, well, they're strong enough, but there's something about that Y position which is inhibiting them accessing or producing force. That could be a painful arc. It could be some sort of pathological, could be that they're more unstable in that Y position than out in a T. It could be, even if we're getting a little bit more, maybe a little bit looser in terms of our analysis here and interpretation, but it could be that the Y position, they have a problem with that sort of diagonal. So it could be that the right shoulder to left hip, for example, isn't linking up very well, or even your lower traps are not doing a job to stabilize your scapula, off which you can then produce force through the arm. So there's lots and lots of different levels of detail that might come behind someone not being able to perform with a ratio that looks like a 1 to 0.85 to 0.75. And we just need to build a lot more information around the test and see, when we put people through with impingements or instabilities, do we tend to see similar patterns in the relationship between those 3 peak force measures?
So far, we in the clinic I'm at, in clinic or in person, we got some fold force plates about a month ago. So I've only been playing around with the ASH test recently, and I tested one firefighter whose status post bank heart, and I didn't dive into the information too much besides just peak force values, and that Y position, he's still pretty stiff into full flexion. So he was stronger, produced more force on that surgical limb. And then in the Y position, he could produce force in more non-surgical. And his subjective sensation was, I feel like I was already like spring loaded, because he couldn't really get to that end position. Whereas he had full motion in the non-surgical limb, where it's like he almost had to start. Like the way he explained it made a lot of sense. Have you had that experience from athletes where they're stiff and it's almost like a advantage to the test?
Yeah, I think the first thing is before we go into ash testing, we would look at their range of motion, right? So can you have you got enough range to get in those positions? Either because you know either you're allowed to do it and you can't, right? So there's no restriction on you doing it, um, or you're just not allowed to do it in the first place. But once you know that they can do it, can they actually get in the range of motion necessary to put the arm in that position? If they can't, you wouldn't test them. But my screen prior to putting them down face down on the ground and pushing into a force platform is just stand in a doorway and just get them to apply force in a T, a Y, and an I. And if there's any problems there in any of those positions with, excessive sensitivity, pain, or they're just not happy, again, we just wouldn't test them. We'd wait and we'd do something to maybe improve things before we looked at trying to be objective. But I understand what you're saying. So sorry, go to the question. I understand what you're saying. And I think one way around that is you can look at net peak force versus peak force. So net peak force is going to give you the force that's already on the platform just by that kind of fact that there's this passive resistance which is pulling them into that horizontal flexion. But that's already going to be registered. So you may find that the stiff side, if you like, has a higher resting level of force, but their max force, the difference between that higher level of force and their peak force is lower than the difference between the more relaxed, more flexible side. And that would show you again that it's probably not down to the contractile elements, it's more down to that passive stiffness. And so there's a difference that you could pick out between those two findings, I think, which would give you some information on the firefighter.
That makes sense. Thank you for that. So you had mentioned the peak values are potentially it's going to take 1, 2, 3 seconds to reach that. From a rate perspective, are there standards or norms you're looking at for how fast should this be? What are these numbers?
Yeah, there are. So with the beauty of the test, and we sort of left it until now to talk about it, but is the rate of force development that you can get, because we're using a piece of equipment, the force plate, that is good enough and sensitive enough to sample at the rate to pick up rates of force development. So I always give the example of someone doing a drop jump. So when they drop off and they hit the ground, if that contact time isn't below 250 milliseconds, we don't call it a drop jump. And so with the ash test, we're looking at the time window from 0 to 250 milliseconds. We're not looking at 1 second or 2 seconds. And I used to do it, and people do it, and they talk about time to peak force. That's hugely variable and quite useful if you don't have access to other tools to see how willing someone is to produce their max quite quickly. But when we're dealing with rate of force, we're dealing with that 250 millisecond time window. And when I do that, I've played around with it. I've looked at 50 milliseconds, and it's just too fast to be a stable, reliable measure. And so 100 is where you start to get some really interesting information that's reliable enough and accurate enough. And you'll see big differences between people who just cannot access a higher percentage of their max in that short space of time. The relevance of that is obviously that injuries and performance tends to happen in a blink of an eye. So we definitely want to capture that that window of time, because if you give athletes time to build up to peak force, they'll take it, and they'll often hit it if they can.
And maybe, do you think this is a good time that we use that specific example from one of your papers? Maybe this provides some.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Do you mind if I just read it and then we go?
Yeah, it's fine. You can read it, or I mean, I suppose you could just link to the paper and just
Sure.
you could link to the paper, and I suppose there was like if you wanted to summarize it a little bit rather than read it all out, it'd probably be better for radio.
Totally. So you have the example y'all used in this Force Awakens editorial you and Daniel Cohen wrote was there's a was he a goalie? Yeah, goalkeeper. He's about 10 weeks out from posterior shoulder repair. Clinically on shoulder range of motion, short lever strength testing, gym-based upper extremity exercises. He's pretty much cleared all of those domains. What you all find from a ASH testing and peak long lever perspective is there is asymmetry on that surgical limb and from the push-up, plyometric push-up. So if those things weren't tested, there would have potentially been a clearance, but due to the nature and the demands of his position, this is extremely valuable to know. That's probably the summary that we'll start with. So knowing that information, that there's still this relatively large asymmetry in the plyometric push-up, which you all noted was about 17% offload symmetry. And then the ASH test, there was about 23% lower rate of force development in the T position. Now, where do you go from a continued rehab and training of those qualities perspective?
Yeah, I think you summarized that really well. The challenge has always been this idea of preventing recurrence. And what we know from the literature, particularly lower limb literature, is that rate of force takes a lot longer than peak force to come back after injury or surgery. That's from hamstrings and ACLs mainly. It's the same in shoulders. So if we're not looking at rate of force, peak forces can come back and we can pass those. But when we then the old school decision making used to be, well, you know, they can move their normal gym weights and they can pass this dynamometer test. Let's send them out there to go and do some goalkeeping, some diving, some top corner saves. But those actions require, you know, some sort of ballistic action, higher rates of force, and the demands are higher. So our tests need to match up to the demand. When we find that we can add in a test that gives us rates of force development information, if those things are not back up, it's suggestive that they can't protect their shoulder under higher velocity exposure. And definitely with goalkeepers in that return to rehab phase, that sort of return to sport, return to diving, return to contact, those are key qualities that they need to have. It's just another part of the overall picture. And the paper was framed around the sort of discussion that you'd have in the morning about what that athlete's going to do on that particular day under pressure, to have that information to be able to say, no, we're not going to allow them to go to the next level until they've hit these markers, gives them an extra layer of objective protection. But I would say, going back to what I say earlier, that if they do hit those markers, then let's go. I mean, let's crack on. They're capable, they're ready. It doesn't matter then about the time frame. It matters more about them hitting a percentage of their recovery, which I think is a critical point. So moving to what do we do when they have this offload asymmetry in a plyo push-up when they land? That, even as a basic level, suggests they're not willing to take force or absorb force through that arm, and they're trying to shift it to the other side. We've all seen it when people jump and land. It's the same in the upper body when you do a plyo push-up. It's a high-level test, and it's this athlete's basically interlimb asymmetry that they create to offload the affected side. So that tells us he's not ready to land, which is a key component of being a goalkeeper. It also, when we look at the ASH test and we look at the rate of force, being 17% down, we'd like to see that back up at normal, so 0% difference, but certainly within 10 before we'd start to integrate them back into those faster actions or those higher rates in goalkeeping. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't goalkeep on that day or they wouldn't go and train. We just have to change training and take off some of those higher velocity actions, and maybe work on more in the program around being a bit more explosive intent with ballistic things like ball catches, and working on those higher rates within the training itself.
That it should be 100% essentially. If you get preseason testing on a goalkeeper and there's a 20% difference in an athlete that has had no prior history, how do you make sense of that and then utilize that? If there is an injury, what's the goal then? If there was already such a big difference, are you always trying to shoot for that as symmetrical as possible number?
Yeah, being really digging into it, you expect somewhere around the old magic 8 to 10% increase in your dominant arm. So if it's your dominant arm, you definitely want it back to the level of the opposite side, and ideally probably 8 to 10% above in terms of peak force production, and therefore rate of force is going to increase a little bit as a result of that. If you've got someone 20% down who's playing and you haven't seen them have a shoulder injury, the concern is that they're grumbling along with some subclinical presentation, or there's something that isn't quite right about that shoulder. So whilst they're still able to play and function, there's a degree of compensation to allow them to do that. Athletes will find a way. And the longer that goes on, the potential is that becomes more of an issue. And it may change from being something that's subclinical to something that you see either in a shoulder instability, or maybe a rotator cuff overload, or even that the shoulder itself starts to cause problems with the rest of the chain in terms of how it's compensating and how they position their body to get the arm into certain positions when they're throwing themselves around to save top corner saves. So it's not one of those where the red lights and the alarm bells are going off and we're really worried and we get them MRI scanned immediately. But it's one of those where we need to start to work on probably those trainable deficits, put something in the program to address that 20% discrepancy and try and bring them up, because we know as a human being their capacity is higher. And that's even if you're just working with one athlete. But if you've got a wealth of data and a database on what a goalkeeper should look like, then you can start to go, well, actually, that's way below expected. So he's 20% down on one side, but actually even his other side isn't very good compared to what we normally see in our goalkeepers. And that's what you aim for. You don't aim for balance necessarily. People can be weak and well balanced, or explosive and not explosive, but equally explosive and balanced and poor in terms of their explosivity. So we've got to set some standards that mean that we've got a benchmark of what we expect for goalkeepers or baseball pitchers or NFL linemen or whatever it is.
You are testing on force plates with the ASH test and the plyometric push-up. How much training for rate and peak are you actually doing on those force plates versus other more dynamic positions? Do you think that's a good starting point because it is still an isometric and you're getting real-time data?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant starting point. In fact, part of the PhD was a pilot study where we managed to get people to test every day for 4 weeks. And we were trying to look at recovery, but what kept happening was people got better and better and better at producing higher rates of force because they were training it in those positions. So I think it's a brilliant way of quantifying improvement, and it's a very useful training tool. What better way of passing a test than doing the test, right? But for me, I would say, look, this is a really trusted way of testing. We know it's reliable. However you want to move the needle on it is up to you as a coach or a physio or part of that team. And then you can start to think about, well, how do we look at overloading some of the key characteristics? Maybe we think of a muscle focus, or maybe we think of a direction specificity or a position that might replicate that test. And then we start to apply different challenges to that position But if you're trying to improve rates of force development, you have to be doing things at a high rate with ballistic intent.
And for individuals that don't have access to force plates, sorry, what is there a way to do this type of testing in long reliever positions? Maybe they can't get the rate aspect, but do you have suggestions? I know there's, I believe, a paper that came out a year or two ago on the reliability and validity of the ASH test with portable isometric based strength training devices. Do you have any input there or thoughts of how people can set that up without force plates?
Yeah, so a guy who I work with now, he starts officially with me next week. Actually, Gus Morrison. He published as part of his masters a validation of a sphygmanometer cuff, so a blood pressure cuff to measure pressure, and he did that and correlated that with the force plates, and it's pretty good for peak forces in terms of the correlation between the two. And our intent with that was exactly as you say, to make it scalable, because it'll give someone this increased level of awareness of the forces they can produce in those long lever position. It might be a 14 to 16-year-old academy athlete with no access to force platform technology, but they could get either a blood pressure cuff, which is pretty cheap, or a bathroom scales, and just put what force can you get down. And even those digital ones now, they'll record it and keep it on the screen so you can see what your values are. So those would be really nice ways of doing it, I think. And if you were up a little level, you might have a cheap dynamometer. There are some available that are a bit more affordable now. And again, there's quite a few studies on people trying to replicate ASH tests or doing something similar with a dynamometer pushed into the ground. So, if you're a clinic and you want to look at shoulders, if you've got one already, just start to apply it to the ASH test. But if you don't, it's such a useful tool, I found, with making decisions around upper body, lower body scores, that you can easily do the ASH test and much, much more with it.
I would have never thought about either of those, even though I've told multiple patients that the force plate is just a very expensive scale that we can just weigh you on if we don't know what your weight is. So yeah, those are very easy and affordable options.
I'm putting some companies out of business here, I think, but I'm not, because the whole point is that we're trying to give people the tools. I'm going to basically put all this together in a short course, which we can talk about later. But essentially, I get a lot of questions from people who don't have access to technology, and I always say it's the thought process, not the technology, that matters. So if we're looking at force production in a T position, we can go in the gym, we can lie on our back, and we can just go into a sort of isometric fly with a straight arm and just see what weight we can hold there off the ground for 10 seconds. And we might compare right versus left. It's a pretty nice, easy, quantifiable tool. And you look at their RPE for how hard it was to hold that weight in that position. Compare the two sides, you've instant gauge of long lever peak force. And it's a useful training tool as well, something we'd use as one of our exercises to try and improve force capacity in a T position.
For the blood pressure cuff, is that something that is viable for stronger individuals, or does it max out pretty quickly?
Depends if you're happy for it to go round past 300 and then keep coming round. We used to use that with groin squeezes, and we'd end up with scores of sort of 500, like off the charts. So yeah, I think a bit of artistic license. I think you can make it work.
To that kind of fly 10-second hold position, besides the isometrics just pushing into the wall or to the force plate where neither of those things are going to move, that's, I guess, more of a discussion of these kind of yielding versus overcoming isometrics. How much do you differentiate between those in rehab and or training, where you have more of those just sustained holds against something where it can be moving and you're just making sure you're holding that position.
Yeah. Essentially, it comes back to the thought process of what's going to move the needle. So I'm always coming back to my outcome driven approach of, okay, well, what are we trying to address? Let's, for example, for ease, take an external rotation deficit. So we've tested them with a dynamometer. We find that they're weak, relatively weak. So we can do a yielding isometric hold. Again, there's loads of ways of doing it. We can do a yielding isometric hold, but is an isometric the highest level of load we can put through the posterior shoulder? No, eccentrics are. So, okay, well, maybe we can do some like nice, easy, slow eccentric work through range using your posterior shoulder, coming into internal rotation. That's probably the best way of overloading the posterior shoulder to give them a stimulus which is going to cause an adaptation in that muscle tendon or that muscle or those groups of muscles that are producing that force. But it's then a question as to, well, is that an easy exercise for them to replicate without cheating? Is there any complexity to the movement which they're going to probably cause compensation? Or are they in season and that kind of overload might leave them a bit sore for a few days when they're trying to perform and do other things like throwing, as an example. So isometrics are almost an eccentric, and so that's why I use them quite a lot. Is they've got a high force without the cost, and they're easily coachable and more difficult to cheat on. So that's why I tend to use a lot of them as a start point. The other beauty of isometrics is you pick a position in a range. As a physio, you can manually test that. Then you can put them in that position. You know they're happy loading there with you doing it, so they'll be happy with a weight. And then once you know they can do it mid-range and then at end range, you can move between the two, A to B, and you probably start to add more dynamic loading on top of that. So that's my sort of steady progression of manual to ISOs through range to dynamic exercise.
Any other, I mean, we could go down a bunch of different rabbit holes, but any things just from this general conversation with ash testing and shoulder testing in general that you want to wrap up with before we go into more of your plans for the future?
It depends, like whether you feel that we've covered useful stuff or things that people are going to be, of value to people. I'm just trying to think if we've missed anything specifically. I don't think so, but you
I don't
tell
think
me.
so either.
Are there future plans for doing a supine version of the ash test?
So as in, like, are we talking pushing back?
Yeah.
I mean, you can ask me that question. I can give you an answer if you want to. If you want, I've done it and it's a bit clunky, is the answer. But I've had colleagues who have done something similar and they've found it useful to get a ratio. But I personally look at the posterior shoulder in a bit of a different way. So yeah, happy to answer that live or up to you.
No, I'm curious. I've seen people talk about it and say that it's really useful, and personally I found it really difficult to get a reliable number, and people just struggle in general with it. And I'm not too sure what population it would be particularly useful for, like maybe backstroke or something. But outside of
Yeah.
that, I think
Okay.
you'd probably find like the decelerative mechanics transfer over to the normal ash test more
Yeah. So
for most
that's
sports.
maybe a good question. Is if you open up with that question, we can go down a tiny bit into. I have tested a lot of these different positions and I've chosen to use these ones, but other people have looked at them and found some value in them. And then the last piece is then the test isn't designed to be sport specific. There are some characteristics of the test that carry over or correspond to certain things. But yeah, that's probably a good line of things to finish off on before we go into future directions.
Sure. So when we're looking at trying to do the most comprehensive testing that we can, do you see that there's a single best position, or across testing a variety of different athletes, is there utility in doing a supine version of this? Do you see a lot of benefit for that? And then does the testing protocol distinctly change for different sporting populations?
Yeah, both questions I am asked reasonably frequently, and perhaps I haven't sort of spoken about it before. But when it comes to the supine version of the Ash test, I mean, literally there are no there are no positions that I haven't got into, including strapping myself to a bed with my pelvis and my thoracic spine, kneeling, standing, split kneeling. I've literally done every position and angle of the Ash test, because we did have a lockdown at one point, and I was pretty bored, so I was trying out a few more things. And I sort of always come back to the original Ash test. It gives me great information, and I don't tend to need a huge amount more. But I do have colleagues that have done posterior shoulder tests, slightly a variation on the Ash test in a Y position, and they found that the normal Ash Y versus the posterior Ash Y, or the modified Ash, have given them a ratio which they like from a health perspective. That's Tim Pello, who works with USOC water polo. And so he found that really useful. Again, it's not published. It's one of those under the hood bits of work, but he's a hugely clever and very experienced person working with a lot of shoulders. So I don't use it particularly. Tim does, and he found a lot of value in it. When it comes back to the second part of the question, I think this is an interesting one, because people sort of say, well, like I've heard people say, well, in baseball, you need to look at the deceleration part. You need to look at the posterior shoulder. Well, my part of my PhD is EMG of the Ash test, and funnily enough, the posterior shoulder is working when we're in a good open chest position and we're pushing forward. It's acting as a dynamic stabilizer. So if you've got a bad Ash test score, or if you're compensating and throwing your shoulder into the movement, you don't produce any higher forces into the platform, and your strategy means that you're not actually getting balanced force across the joint. The posterior shoulder's switched off. The mid-back stabilizers aren't working. So a good Ash test which looks good, you're probably getting front and back of glenohumeral joint and also scapular stabilizers having to work to do that. But I do personally then from that level come back to, okay, well, I'm going to look into the posterior shoulder using external rotation. And I do believe that it is important to look at the posterior shoulder, but I tend to use tests of capacity and work capacity, like a posterior shoulder endurance test in a T and a Y position. And I look at that probably more so than I do at peak force in a posterior direction. And that's just personal preference. But largely it comes back to, I want a test that works. I don't need it to look like the sport, but I do need the forces that we produce, the positions that we produce those forces. And if we think about it in terms of magnitude, rate, and timing of force production, certain parts of the Ash test should correspond to certain parts of the sport, or certain parts of the needs analysis with regard to injury that you're coming across with the athletes you work with. So, to summarize that, it was never designed as a sport-specific test. It started to help the rugby team solve those long lever tackle questions and problems. Since then, it's been used by multiple sports, throwing, combat, in all sorts of ways. And it often doesn't look like that sport, but they found the information that it gives them really valuable to help plan whether we look down a force production route or a rate of force development route.
Any follow-ups to that, Sam? No. Sweet. So Ben, you had mentioned you're going to create a course on this topic, but you're juggling a lot of things. You've got the PhD course, consulting. So what does the next year or two look like for you and things you want to chat about?
Yeah, actually, I just had a chance to reflect on the start to this year, which has been mildly manic. Traveling to see to do some work with two baseball teams, coming back to work with special forces in this country, and to support some military rehabs, and then also trying to build a rehab setup in London to deliver to people with high shoulder demand. So the next few years is to build on the learning, the online course we've released, to add more shorter courses to that, to bolt them on and to add value in different ways. In terms of the in-person delivery, I think I'll be traveling to various places, to the Middle East, to Canada at some point, and we'll go where the wind blows to come and deliver some in-person courses. There's the rehab side of it, and that higher level second opinion, but providing a service in London, which is I'm building a team there. And then the last piece is consultancy with teams. So it depends on the team, but I've worked with circus performers, baseball, and NFL teams. And then in the UK, we've got rugby. And in the next 2 weeks, I'm at two Premier League teams to go and talk through shoulder testing and how to set that up and what we do with the answers when we get those. And it's just all around the same thing, but probably divided into kind of three aspects of the business. And at the moment, that's enough on my plate with a PhD running along and grumbling in the background.
Good luck with all of that. But those are all very exciting things. And I'm excited for those courses and a lot of the online stuff. Are you coming to the States anytime soon to give any in-person courses?
I actually did. I went to the States. I actually did a first course in Canada. I did one in Vancouver, and then I people who knew me there and followed me on social media didn't even know I was coming. So that was a lesson around marketing. And then I ended up being able to use the UFC Apex to set up a course through Duncan French, and we put on a course down there for 12 to 15 people from different walks of life. Some people from hockey, some from state football, and other things. So really good bunch down there. So the intent is, yes, I will do them at some point, and I'll potentially be coming to America in July and September this year. It's not ring fenced yet, but it's in the pipeline. So yeah, happy, as I say, to go where the wind blows.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ben, and enjoy the bank holiday, King's holiday.
Yeah, it's the King's coronation this weekend. It's another excuse for the UK to take a few more days off. No one likes a Monday at work, and we've probably not got many Mondays to do in May thanks to the King. So yeah, I'll be toasting him all weekend.
Nice. All right. Thanks again, Ben.
Cheers.